countries except Germany, Lithuania is negotiating to send, to deploy air defense capabilities? Thank you.
From my part, I don't have any newer information about the deployment of Wagner troops or units into Belarus.
Okay. What about air defense? Air defense, when you will make the decision to send units to Lithuania?
Air defense, well, we made our decision for the summit this year, but not more at the moment.
This is the issue I would like to touch too, because air defense systems are critically important, especially in the crisis scenario. Of course, the air policing missions are important during the peacetime, but air defense systems are much more important if the situation starts to deteriorate. And the war in Ukraine showed that really to control the airspaces is one of the most important possibilities to reduce the losses, especially during initial stage of the crisis. But regarding your question, yes, Minister already mentioned that now we are talking about air defense systems provided during the NATO summit and shortly afterwards. We are talking about air defense systems on a rotational basis after the Vilnius summit. And I already started my discussions with different allies, namely Netherlands, France, Germany, and other countries, but so far it's very complicated issue to answer this question and who will be responsible for which part or which element of air defense systems. Much more important is that we already have the conclusion or decision on the NATO level that air defense systems in the eastern flank on rotational basis, this is probably adequate response to the current situation, and we are looking forward to cooperate with our partners in the nearest future regarding this issue.
Thank you. We have a second media question, please.
Natalia Drozdiak from Bloomberg. Thank you so much for the questions. For Secretary Stoltenberg, what impact does NATO expect the Wagner events to have on the battlefield in Ukraine? And German Minister Pistorius, I was curious to ask, why did Germany change its decision about having permanent troops based in Lithuania? Was this at all tied to the Wagner events over the weekend, or was this in motion already before? Thank you.
I think what we've seen in Russia over the last days demonstrates the fragility of the German regime. And of course it is a demonstration of weakness.
The German regime?
When there are... Sorry?
Not the German regime.
No, sorry, the Russian... sorry.
I'm sorry. They're quite stable at the moment.
Sorry. We see the weakness of the Russian regime, and it also demonstrates how difficult and dangerous it is for President Putin to be reliant on mercenaries. That has actually turned against him. And it also demonstrates that it is hard to predict exactly what will now happen in the next days and weeks. But we should not make the mistakes that we are underestimating the Russians. So we need to continue to provide support to Ukraine. And that's exactly what NATO and NATO allies are doing with military support, but also support for the long term. And that's in a way what we can say today about the effects on the battlefield in Ukraine.
To your question, it is not really a change of our position. As today was to say, we are willing to do that under two preconditions. And the one is, of course, the infrastructure which the Lithuanian government is willing and prepared to provide as soon as possible. And we agreed to build up the brigade in the same speed like improving, like building up the infrastructure succeeds in Lithuania. And the second point is very important too, regarding and looking to Jens Stoltenberg. Of course, SACEUR has certain interests and very important interests too. So we said he has to have the possibility to maintain military flexibility at the eastern flank, which is very important too. So if he does not disagree, if he doesn't disagree, we will go on and proceed in that way.
From my side, I can only assure you that our part of the job we will do as good as possible and as quick as possible, meaning elements of infrastructure in order to accommodate the brigade size presence of German troops in my country.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, please.
Thank you very much. Michael Fischer, German Press Agency. I have a question for the Secretary General, first of all. Does NATO need to react in any way on the recent developments in Russia? President Nauseda, for example, suggested yesterday to strengthen the eastern flank of NATO right now if the Wagner troops will settle in Belarus. Is that an option from your point of view, or are there any consequences for the NATO-Russia Founding Act? And my second question to you would be, what message goes out from the permanent deployment of the German brigade that was announced by Minister Pistorius today? What message goes out to Mr. Putin and Mr. Lukashenko from that deployment? And Mr. Nauseda, a question on the brigade too. The condition is that Lithuania builds the infrastructure for the brigade. By when will that be finished?
Let me start by saying that we, of course, very much welcome the German leadership, which has been demonstrated throughout actually a long time, but it's very much enhanced by the German announcement today, because a German-led battle group, but also more German troops deployed here, shows a strong German commitment to our collective defense, to our shared security, and it's part of the adaptation of NATO which has taken place since 2014 with high readiness of forces, but also with more deployments of combat-ready NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance, including the battle groups, and one of them is the German-led battle group here in Lithuania. So this demonstrates German leadership, German commitment to our transatlantic bond, and it also demonstrates the value of a multilateral NATO commitment to a country like Lithuania. It sends, of course, a message, our presence here, and also the exercise we just watched, of NATO readiness and NATO capability to defend every inch of NATO territory. And the reason we do that is, of course, not to provoke a conflict, but it is to prevent the conflict, because credible deterrence is about preventing war, it's about preventing conflict, it's about preventing an attack and preserving peace. And this is not only about forward presence, which is important, but it's also about pre-positioned equipment supplies, high readiness and exercises. So it's all of this together, backed also by significant air and naval power. And that also fits into the issue of air defense. I think, of course, land-based air defense systems are important, but we have to understand that when we now have this rotational model in place for air defense, which can make it easier for us to switch from air policing to air defense, air forces is also part of air defense, and naval forces can also provide the short notice. So this is the German announcement is welcomed, and it's part of a pattern, a big adaptation of NATO that have taken place over several years. One more thing about this is that we will also make important decisions at the Vilnius in Summit on the new force structure, the new with plans that will dedicate specific forces to protect specific territories. This is the first time since actually the Cold War where we are going to have plans linked to specific forces to protect specific territories. Then the first question was on... yeah, well, so first of all, I think it's a bit early to say exactly because things may still evolve. Second, we are, of course, monitoring very closely and we are able to react quickly if there is a need. At the same time, I think it is important to remind you all that this is about internal Russian matters. And therefore what NATO is focused on is to support Ukraine. It demonstrates the fragility of the Russian regime, but it's not for NATO to intervene in those issues. That's a Russian matter. What matters for NATO is to not be intimidated, not be prevented from continue to provide unprecedented support for Ukraine, and also, of course, to have the necessary deterrence and defense. We have that already. We have increased our presence over the years, and with the German announcement, we have yet another example of how allies are increasing their presence. But again, it's not only about presence, it's also about the ability to have early warnings, indications, and then react quickly if there is a need, and this exercise demonstrates exactly that.
My part of the question, we are simplify the procedures and technical procedures, legal procedures in order to be able to finalize the building of infrastructure by 2026, but I will be not angry if the Minister of Defense, which is sitting in front of me, will finalize in 2025. Anyway, we have a strong political commitment in Lithuania to find out the necessary financial resources in order to be able to finance the needs of infrastructure, but of course, hand in hand, modernization of our armed forces, it's very important priority to us too.
Thank you. The press conference is over. I wish everyone a pleasant afternoon.